Good afternoon. Just before I begin the lecture, just have a look at the fly sheet, please. The fly sheet is extremely detailed in terms of the quotations that I give. Every quotation that I use in the course of the lecture is given on the fly sheet. And you can use the quotations to get into the text by going over the quotations afterwards. The reason I give many quotations is partly to help you get into the text, but also because I think that CS is about giving evidence for one's interpretations from the text. At the bottom of the second page, you have a small note on the quality which Odysseus particularly is celebrated for in the Odyssey, the quality of metis, which I will talk about quite a bit. And you should be aware that Athene, the goddess who helps Odysseus all the way, or actually not quite all the way, because Athene is not present at the time of the Cyclops. She only appears later. Right? But Athene is herself the goddess of metis. So it's important. Right? Okay. So, for 3 years, Penelope tricked the suitors by saying she would marry one of them when she'd finished weaving a piece of cloth. By day, she would weave the cloth, but by night, she would undo the weaving until she was found out and forced to finish. Odysseus says to Athene at the end of Book 13, when asking her advice about how to proceed, "Come, weave the design." Design is the term metis. Penelope says to the stranger beggar, who is really Odysseus in disguise, that to put off the suitors, I quotes, "weave my own wiles." Odysseus, when he is swimming in the sea for his life alone, wonders which of the gods is weaving deception against me. So the image of weaving is much used by Homer, and Homer's art is itself like weaving a design. This is why I've called my lecture, "Weaving the Design, the Irony of Disguise." I want to look at how Homer uses disguise and deception in his epic. At the back of this is a notion of the Odyssey as an epic drama read out loud, not performed live. Not read as you are doing, sung over a number of days by a poet who to some extent is free to change things. Now, the first point I want to emphasize is that disguise is a form of namelessness, and that the whole epic concerns the naming and recognition of Odysseus as a hero. But there's a difference between how the theme of naming and recognition is treated in the first half of the epic and in the second half. Remember that we only meet Odysseus in Book 5 on the island of Calypso, who has kept him hidden with her for 7 years. Book 5 ends with Odysseus struggling onto the Phaeacians' island after swimming for his life, exhausted, naked, alone, and nameless. There's nobody else to tell the Phaeacians who he is. He can't tell them himself because the world is full of wandering nobodies who would believe him. Somewhere, somehow, starting from nothing, he has to get himself into a position where he will be acknowledged as Odysseus by the Phaeacians, honored by them with gifts, and taken home. He does this by using the quality which sets him apart as a hero, the quality of cunning intelligence or metis. During a feast, still as an unnamed stranger, he asks the Phaeacian singer Demodocus to sing the story of how Odysseus tricked the Trojans with the wooden horse. His reaction to Demodocus' song prompts the Phaeacian king to ask the stranger who he is. This is at the end of Book 8. Odysseus identifies himself. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, known before all men for the study of crafty designs. And he starts telling the story of his great wandering from the time he and his companions left Troy. It's an unusual story, full of semi-gods, semi-human beings, not the kind of stories about heroes or gods that people were used to. Halfway through, he pauses, and Alcinous, the Phaeacian king, comments on its unusual form. We, as we look upon you, do not imagine that you are a deceptive or thievish man, he says, making up lying stories from which no one could learn anything. You have a grace upon your words, and there is sound sense within them, and expertly, as a singer would do, you have told the story of the dismal sorrows befallen yourself and all the Greeks. But, he goes on, come now, tell me this and give me an accurate answer. Did you see any of your godlike companions who once with you went to Troy and there met their destiny? That's to say, can you give us a more normal story of heroes who died on the field of battle? And Odysseus, his audience entranced, immediately tells how he met the spirit of Agamemnon and Achilles in Hades. Homer the poet thus is constructing a new kind of epic of homecoming and the restoration of order rather than of war. And he has his hero, Odysseus, tell his own story, sing his own fame. So we've got 3 issues mixed together. 1, a new kind of epic. 2, a correspondingly new kind of hero who uses storytelling to further his purpose. And 3, namelessness, or the process of being recognized as somebody, not nobody. Of course, the first major story he tells is how he got out of the Cyclops cave by pretending to be called nobody, which is why thematically the story is so important. The second half of the epic plays on namelessness differently. Here, disguise is central. What appears to be a wandering beggar, a nobody, is really a hero. The hero Odysseus in disguise. Again, the hero is landed on an island, this time his own island of Ithaca, alone, without companions to say who he is. But this time he knows he is alone against numerous young men, the suitors, who have been pestering his wife Penelope to marry one of them. Somehow, he has to manipulate himself into a position where he can control events and his own actual story. Again, he does this by using his special skill of cunning intelligence and by telling stories of what he knows about the real Odysseus. At one point, the swineherd Eumaeus says to Penelope, "Such stories he tells. He would charm out the dear heart within you, as when a man looks to a singer who has been given from the gods the skill with which he sings for delight of mortals. So he enchanted me in the halls as he sat beside me." And Homer himself says in Book 19, very important quotation, "He knew how to say many false things that were like true sayings." Because the beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, claims to have news of the real Odysseus, he gains an interview with his wife Penelope. There is then a very poignant part of the story when appearance and reality are very close together. When Odysseus in disguise is talking about the real Odysseus to Penelope, foretelling his own return. He persuades Penelope that he has a special relation with the real Odysseus and is invited by her to attend the feast the following day, when the suitors will compete to string Odysseus' bow and win her for wife. The second half of the epic thus goes from Odysseus as nothing to his being recognized as husband, father, hero, king, to the restoration of order in his palace, and to the revelation of truth, as opposed to all the lying stories, disguise, and deception he has had to use to gain his homecoming. The movement is from outer to inner identity and recognition. Odysseus moves from the outermost part of his estate to his palace and then to the inner chambers of his wife. The final recognition of Odysseus by his wife Penelope involves her testing him about the marriage bed. I'll return to untangle some of these issues later, but for the moment I want to emphasize that Odysseus' skill in storytelling is part of his general ability to get the better of every situation, what in ancient Greek is called metis. Translated here as cunning intelligence, design, or perfect planning. A singer is close to the gods, for he is inspired by the muse and tells of events that ordinary mortals do not know of. Similarly, the quality of metis is godlike in a way, in that it is able to pierce through the established order of things to secure an advantage. It threatens the order of gods and men, and it is for this reason that Odysseus is punished by Poseidon when he shows such incredible metis by getting out of the Cyclops' cave. It's not just because Poseidon is Polyphemus, his father. Homer the poet is putting his own skill as a singer into the picture of heroism in the Odyssey. The relation between singing and commanding events is made explicit by Homer at the key point when Odysseus in disguise, having been invited by Penelope to attend the feast of the bow, is given the bow after several suitors have tried to string it and failed. This is the climax up to which the second half has led, when Odysseus is able to string the bow and reveals himself and takes control. The suitors are, of course, dismissive of the beggar handling the bow. He must be a thief, they say. So the suitors talked. But now, resourceful Odysseus, once he had taken up the great bow and looked it all over, as when a man who well understands the lyre and singing, easily holding it on either side, pulls the strongly twisted cord of sheep's gut so as to slip it over a new peg, so, without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow. Then, plucking it in his right hand, he tested the bowstring, and it gave him back an excellent sound, like the voice of a swallow. And Zeus, showing forth his signs, thundered mightily. Odysseus then throws off his rags and says, "Here is a task that has been achieved without deception." And he starts killing the suitors. Let me now go back and take up some of the central issues. Disguise is a central element in the second half of the Odyssey, because Odysseus is alone. When he gets back to Ithaca, he has to use the two qualities for which he made himself famous. When in Troy, he made himself famous by devising the trick of the wooden horse. The same quality which got him out of the Cyclops' cave. The second quality that he uses is the quality to endure humiliation and suffering. An adjective used for him is long-suffering. When he visited Hades in Book 11, during his great wanderings, he heard from the blind prophet Tiresias that suitors were pestering his wife Penelope to marry one of them and eating up all the stock of his estate. But in fairness, he should assess the situation for himself. He has heard that Penelope has been faithful to him, but should he believe hearsay? He must test the truth for himself. His son, Telemachus, will have recently come into manhood, but of his qualities, Odysseus has no experience. Can Telemachus be relied upon not to give the game away when his father is being humiliated in the palace by the suitors and by servants? Odysseus doesn't know. For these reasons, Athene advises him to go in disguise in order to make trial of each and everyone on his estate. Gods also go in disguise. It's one of the reasons you have to treat everybody well, because you never know who might be behind an appearance. When one of the suitors throws a footstool at Odysseus in disguise in Book 17, others are shocked and say, "You did badly to hit the unhappy vagabond. A curse on you if he turns out to be some god from heaven." For the gods do take on all sorts of transformations, appearing as strangers from elsewhere, and thus they range at large through the cities, watching to see which men keep the laws and which are violent. Behind the figure of a beggar, there may be a king and hero. By going in disguise, Odysseus is able to make a trial of the appearances of things, testing the reality behind appearances. Disguised as a wandering beggar, he can go anywhere. As someone who has been wandering from place to place, however, he is expected to lie and exaggerate, not to tell the truth. Here lies the dramatic irony of the epic. Appearances have to be tested. Odysseus has to go in disguise, even on his own land, in his own home. How do his servants, how do the suitors, how does his son, his father, his wife treat him when they don't know who he is? Do they treat wandering strangers, nobodies, properly? Moreover, in disguise as a beggar who says he has wandered afar and heard news of Odysseus, he is the bearer of truth about his own homecoming, something for which everyone is waiting, on which the whole situation depends. But why should a hungry beggar be believed? Penelope has become so habituated to the unpleasant reality of Odysseus' absence that her mind takes refuge in dreams, a different kind of wandering. Finally, when Odysseus throws off his disguise and confronts the suitors, he is the bearer of truth in another sense, that of a higher moral reality behind appearances. For he will restore the order that was upset in his absence by the continued disorderly, violent presence of the suitors. These three aspects of truth, disguise, and wandering are interwoven in the epic. Indeed, the Greek word for truth, aletheia, literally means not hidden, not disguised, not forgotten. A singer in ancient Greece has the special role of not letting famous men and events be forgotten. And in this sense, a singer not only makes a hero's name immortal, he creates truth. In sound, aletheia is very close to the word for wandering, aletheia. Aletheia and aletheia. Homer makes use of the close sound of these two words, playing on where their meanings intersect. For instance, in Book 14, the swineherd Eumaeus says to Odysseus in disguise, who has come to his yard as a vagabond, "Old sir, there is none who could come here bringing a report of him," i.e. of the true Odysseus, "and persuade his wife and his dear son. And yet there are vain and vagabond men in need of sustenance who tell lies and are unwilling to tell a true story. And any vagrant who makes his way to the land of Ithaca goes to my mistress and babbles his lies to her, and she then receives him well and entertains him and asks him everything. So you too, old sir, might spin out a well-made story if someone would give you a cloak or tunic to wear for it." Note here the play on spinning or weaving. Eumaeus, the swineherd, after hearing the vagabond's tale, says that nothing will convince him that Odysseus is still alive. The irony, of course, is that Odysseus is standing right in front of him, though in disguise. The second half of the epic thus plays on the theme of wandering in a different way from the first. The first has the wandering hero wandering over the sea, calling on all manner of half-gods, nymphs, and magical beings, as well as journeying to the underworld to meet the spirits of the dead. It's a voyage that tests his powers of endurance and cunning intelligence. Poseidon, whose realm is the sea, has caused Odysseus a lot of trouble, though he hasn't been able to prevent his homecoming, for this is ordained by the gods. But the voyage home should also be seen in the light of what is expected of a man in times of peace, who wants to build up a reputation for himself or fame and to have a successful homecoming instead of a tragic one. So at the risk of going over issues that you may already have discussed in class, I'm going to go over 6 background issues. And we're now at point 5 on the fly sheet. The first of these background issues is the nature of Odysseus' heroism. I've already said a bit about this. Odysseus had proved himself on the field of battle at Troy. The problem of the Odyssey is to demonstrate a set of qualities that enable a hero to have a successful homecoming against all odds, something emphasized in the first lines of the play. A hero who dies on the field of battle makes a name for himself that will last forever. But what about the hero who survives? The first contrast here is with Achilles, the hero of the Iliad who died at Troy, whose spirit Odysseus meets in Hades, and whose memory Odysseus recalls when he is swimming for his life in the sea after leaving Calypso, and Poseidon has sent a little storm to break up his boat. Will Odysseus die in the sea? Unknown. Far better to have died at Troy like Achilles. Achilles himself doesn't agree. He'd far prefer to be a landless labourer, alive, not dead. The other contrast in heroism is with the returned leader of the Greek expedition, Agamemnon, and his wife, Clytemnestra. His wife didn't remain faithful while he was away, but ran off with another man, Aegisthus, and together they kill Agamemnon when he returns. This is not a good example of a hero's homecoming. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was still too young to do anything about the murder at the time, and he fled. But later, he killed both his mother and her new husband, and the whole story becomes a favorite topic of Greek tragedy, killing the mother. Agamemnon's homecoming is tragic. The contrast of Agamemnon with Odysseus, then, is not only hero with hero, but hero's wife with wife, son with son. Penelope is faithful, Clytemnestra is not. Orestes eventually punishes the wrongdoing of his mother and Aegisthus. What is Telemachus' role to be? This brings us to the second background issue of Telemachus' age. It's essential to the plot of the Odyssey that Telemachus should just be coming into manhood at the time of Odysseus' return. It is this that makes the situation on Ithaca so electric, ready to boil over. At the very time that it does come to a head, when Penelope decides to set up the bow contest in order to see whom she will remarry, there Odysseus is, ready and waiting, ready to reveal himself, the truth behind the disguise. The effect of Telemachus' coming of age, starting to take the charge of his absent father's household, however, is twofold. One on his mother, the other on the suitors. The suitors see Telemachus as a threat to their own position, not only because he might become their king, but also because he's spoiling the good times they are having at his expense. And they plot to kill him. Their hostility thus comes into the open, whereas previously, when Telemachus had been younger, they hadn't bothered about him. The effect of Telemachus' coming of age on his mother Penelope, on the other hand, is to force her to take a decision about remarriage. As she tells one of the suitors in Book 18, Odysseus had advised her before he left to keep everything in her charge. But, quotes, when you see our son bearded and grown up, then you may marry whatever man you please, forsaking your household. And to Odysseus himself, when he is in disguise as a beggar, and she is quizzing him about news of the real Odysseus, Penelope says, Now I cannot escape from this marriage. I can no longer think of another plan. The word she uses here is metis, very important. I can no longer think of another plan. My parents are urgent with me to marry. My son is vexed as they eat away our livelihood. He sees it all. He is a grown man now, most able to care for the house. And the beggar Odysseus in disguise advises her not to put off the contest of the bow any longer. So because Telemachus is coming of age, the situation is ripe for resolution. And in fighting against the suitors, Telemachus does well. He's a worthy son of his heroic father. The third background issue. The third background issue. The third background issue is the context of gift-giving and hospitality. Normally, in peacetime, during the Homeric age, how did a person build up his reputation? In three ways, I suggest. One, by upholding the proper laws of Zeus in relation to hospitality. Two, by calling on people, being honored as a guest with gifts, and establishing long-term alliances, also sealed with gifts. And three, through raiding expeditions and plunder. I'm not going to go into any of these issues here, except to ask you to be aware, when reading, of the special idea of a guest gift, a special term, whether it is a bad guest gift, like the ones the Cyclops or nasty suitor gives, or good. Good guest gifts sealed friendships or treaties between different kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean in Homeric times. What were the two bad guest gifts that the Cyclops gave? Homer uses the term guest gift. What were the two bad guest gifts? No? The first bad guest gift was when he knew Odysseus' name was Nobody. So he says, now, Mr. Nobody, I shall eat you last. The story is partly a play on order. And the second guest gift is when he knows Odysseus' true name, and he calls out to his father Poseidon to make things difficult for Odysseus. Fourth background issue, the question of order. A hero has to uphold not only the cosmic order, but more importantly in the Odyssey, which concerns peace, not war, the social and moral order. It's this social and moral order that's been disturbed by the unruly, violent presence of the suitors in Odysseus' palace while he's absent, and that Odysseus, on his homecoming, has to restore. Apart from the abuse of Zeus's law of hospitality, the suitors don't honor the gods properly by sacrificing meat or pouring a libation of wine whenever they feast. And, quotes, they give way to the violence and force in themselves. It's when a person gives way to the force and violence in himself that actions become reckless, which in turn calls for punishment. So there are three levels of order reflecting each other: cosmic order, social order, and personal order. The ideal of personal order is a well-balanced mind and moderation, something you'll come back to when reading Aristotle later in 201. In all things, balance is better, says Menelaus. As far as social order is concerned, the head of a household maintains its order. Good leadership, in turn, leads to good government and to people's prosperity. In the leader's absence, however, the order is liable to go to pieces. Penelope laments to Odysseus in disguise that, quotes, there are none to give orders left in the household. And the swineherd Eumaeus says, serving men, when their masters are no longer about to make them work, are no longer willing to do their rightful duties. So these are some of the more general background issues. There are two other general points which I want to make before going through bits of the second half in greater detail. The idea of putting everybody on trial has already been mentioned. Odysseus has to test in person the behavior of the suitors, the loyalty of his servants, his wife, even his father. How do people treat him? Athene praises him for this quality, which demonstrates his metis, something which she herself is famous for, being the daughter of the goddess Metis. But in addition to the idea of testing individuals behind the appearance, the idea of testing everybody competitively is also marked. The contest of the bow marks the climax of the story, when only Odysseus is able to string the bow, and when he shoots an arrow through a line of axe heads. How the beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, has been allowed to enter the contest after several suitors have failed, and the leader suggests postponing the contest until the following day, you must read for yourselves. Both Penelope unknowingly and Telemachus knowingly take a part. You can imagine what some of the suitors might have felt about a beggar being allowed a chance to string the bow, even if he is now Telemachus' guest and has been washed and clothed on Penelope's orders. One of them says, "We are ashamed to face the talk of the men and women, for fear some others might say, they are not able even to string the bow." Then another, some beggar man, came wandering in from somewhere and easily strung the bow. That would be a disgrace for us all. Yes, indeed, more than a disgrace, it'll be the destruction. Note the play on wanderer and nobody here. And what does Odysseus say when he has shot the arrow through the axe heads? Here's a task that has been achieved without deception. Reality in the raw, the beginning of the end, when order is restored and truth revealed. The idea of a contest, not only in athletics like the Olympic Games, but also in drama and poetry, was very important to the ancient Greeks. That's how drama originated. The second general point is just the skill of the poet, weaving his story into our hearts. When you read the second half, do please be aware of the dramatic effects Homer is using to draw the reader into the story and become emotionally involved. You have to imagine the Odyssey being recited out loud, live. The audience knows the story, but the people to whom Odysseus is talking do not. This is where irony comes in. What happens when his faithful dog recognizes him behind his disguise? Will his old nurse recognize the scar on his leg? Above all, when Odysseus in disguise is talking to his wife Penelope, many of the remarks to each other have particular pathos and irony. And it's this that I'm going to try and bring out in the next portion. So, the wandering beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, has already claimed to the swineherd Eumaeus that he has knowledge of the real Odysseus, whose imminent return he has prophesied. This is reported to Penelope, who naturally wants to question the man herself. So, she summons Odysseus in disguise for an interview while the suitors are still feasting. But Odysseus tells Eumaeus, who brings the summons, that it would be better to wait until the suitors have gone home for the night, because they're so unruly. As both Eumaeus and Penelope observe, ironically, this is a funny beggar who refuses the opportunity of a good supper and clothes. A bashful vagabond, they say, makes a bad beggar. But Penelope agrees, and after the suitors have gone, this is now the beginning of book 19, she descends to the hall, where there are still a few serving maids clearing up, one of whom is especially insulting to the vagabond beggar. Odysseus in disguise spins a tale to Penelope about how he had entertained the real Odysseus in Crete 19 years ago, soon after the latter had left on the expedition for Troy. By claiming to be the brother of someone with whom Odysseus had a hereditary friendship, one of those special alliances I mentioned sealed with a guest gift, and to have entertained Odysseus in his brother's absence, Odysseus in disguise is laying claim to Penelope's protection. He knew how to say many false things that were like true sayings, Homer comments. And then, quotes, as she listened, her tears ran, and her body was melted, as the snow melts along the high places of the mountains, and as it melts, the rivers run full flood. It was even so that her beautiful cheeks were streaming tears, as Penelope wept for her man, who was sitting there by her side. This is Homer the poet, both drawing the audience into the emotion of the situation and pointing out its irony. Odysseus's eyes, Homer says, stayed steady under his lids. He hid his tears and deceived her. Now comes Penelope's first test. If you knew him when he left here 19 years ago, she says, I will give you a test. What was he wearing? Odysseus in disguise says, well, it's a long time ago, but... And he proceeds to describe minutely the clasp that he wore on his cloak. This earns Penelope's respect. Some things, he says, are true. And she says, stranger, while before this you had my pity, you shall now be my friend and be respected here in the palace. But Odysseus in disguise presses on and say, I say to you, without deception, without concealment, that I have heard of the present homecoming of Odysseus. Oh, if only this were true, Penelope replies, you would be sent on your way with full honor. But alas, she says, there are none to give orders left in the household, such as Odysseus was among men, if he ever existed. If he ever existed. Is this irony? Since to the audience, Odysseus is right in front of Penelope. Is she unconsciously inviting him to throw off his disguise? Does she suspect something? Or is her mind wandering? She decides he needs a bath if he is to appear the following day as a guest at the feast. He says that only some aged and virtuous woman must do this. So Penelope appoints his old nurse, Eurycleia, to the task. There's then a marvelous scene when she looks at the old man and says how like Odysseus in build he is, and how the real Odysseus even now must be suffering in much the same way as the beggar in front of her. She recognizes an old scar on his leg, and Odysseus has to clamp his hand over her mouth not to give the game away, because it's not a game. Odysseus is testing his wife, and the timing of any disclosure he makes is crucial to his success against the suitors. Anyway, after his bath, Penelope again sits with the disguised Odysseus. Friend, she says, I will stay here and talk to you, just for a while. To be sure, it will soon be the time for sweet rest, since one delicious sleep takes hold of, although he may be sorrowful. Note the play on sinking back from reality here. She asks him to interpret a dream she has had. This is now in the intimacy of the night. In the dream, she says, an eagle swooped down and killed all the geese she kept in the courtyard. But the eagle then perched on a roof and in a human voice said, "Do not fear. This is no dream, but a blessing, real as day. You will see it done. The geese are the suitors, and I, the eagle, am your own husband. Come home, and I shall inflict shameless destruction on all the suitors." This is Penelope recounting a dream, foretelling Odysseus' return to Odysseus in disguise, who is sitting right in front of her. What does he say in reply? "Lady," he says, "it is impossible to read this dream and avoid it by turning another way, since Odysseus himself has told you its real meaning, how it will end. The suitor's doom is evident." So we've got a triple conjunction. Odysseus in the dream as an eagle, foretelling to Penelope the imminent return of the real Odysseus and the suitor's destruction. The real Odysseus in disguise as a wanderer, telling her the same thing, and Odysseus in disguise interpreting the meaning of the dreamt Odysseus' prophecy. Is this Homer sending us all up? Or does it signify the intangibility of truth, the ease with which the proper order of reality can be veiled and from which one can wander? Penelope, anyway, will have none of it. These are, after all, words, not deeds. She says, dreams come out of one of two gates. Deceptive dreams that never come true come out of the gate of ivory, whereas those that do come true come out of the gate of horn. And she's afraid that this dream came out of the gate of ivory. I is deceptive. Anyway, with only disguised reality and dreamt truth, what can she do? The real Odysseus has not yet turned up and actually revealed himself. So Odysseus in disguise goes to sleep in the hall, and she sleeps in her chambers. He lies awake, bothered about how the following day will turn out and how he's going to avoid the suitors' families taking revenge on him if he manages to kill them. She cries a little. And then she prays to the goddess Artemis, prays that she dies so that she can meet Odysseus in death, rather than have to marry one of the infernal suitors. But then she checks herself and says, any evil is endurable because, after all, there is always sleep. Sleep is the oblivion of all things, both evil and good. And with sleep come dreams. This very night, she says to herself, there was one who lay by me, like him as he was when he went on the expedition to Troy, so that my own heart was happy. I thought it was no dream, but a waking vision. So you get the idea, I hope. When the story is reaching its climax with the bow contest, when the suitor's wrongdoing will finally be punished, order restored, and Odysseus will throw off his disguise and reveal himself no longer as a wandering nobody, but as a hero who has succeeded by using cunning intelligence, not simple physical force, there is a long play on Penelope's bewilderment as a metaphor for the bewilderment of mortals in distinguishing a true path from a false one. Dreams, waking visions, sleep, death. Is he really and truly dead, even though I've waited for him for 20 years? Will I really have to marry one of the infernal suitors? Truth, after all, when revealed, is still difficult to recognize. So, this is the last point, she gives him a test. And in this test, Homer himself has a last trick up his sleeve. Penelope has to test whether the person who was a wandering beggar, but has now been bathed and spruced up, is really her husband. Come, she says to a servant, make up the bed outside our marriage bed. What? Says Odysseus with real anger. Who has changed my bed? Who has moved it from the place where I built it on an olive tree? So in this test, Penelope outsmarts the master of cunning, Metis. And Homer, in turn, outsmarts us, listeners and readers, for unexpectedly we see that Penelope is more than a match for Odysseus in Metis. Husband and wife are thus truly alike in mind, as Odysseus has said is the ideal to Nausicaa, the daughter of the Phaeacian king. Weaving a design with the wandering beggar who is Odysseus in disguise, telling so many stories about the real Odysseus, none of which are likely to be believed. What is Homer saying about his own art? The creation of fame, legend, immortality, truth. Thank you for your attention.